All right, let's jump right into this explainer and explore how the American Revolution was, at its core, a massive, incredibly dynamic shift in identity. We so often think of the revolution as just a sequence of famous battles and dusty dates, but right beneath the gunfire and all those treaties, there was a profound psychological transformation going on. We're really looking at the story of a people inventing a completely new kind of country, one built not around a king, but around a very loud, highly contested argument over how people actually ought to be governed. So here's the massive mystery we're unraveling today. Absolutely nothing about this revolution was inevitable. Think about it. We are looking at 13 scattered, fiercely independent coastal settlements just clinging to the edge of a vast, wild continent. And on the other side of the Atlantic, Great Britain, a literal global superpower with the world's most formidable navy and a highly disciplined professional army. So how on earth did a ragtag collection of farmers and merchants actually pull this off? Well, it starts with an astonishingly rapid psychological leap made in just 16 short years. Picture yourself standing in a Boston tavern in 1760. The people around you did not consider themselves Americans. Not at all. They were deeply proud British subjects. They drank British tea, read British newspapers, and they celebrated British military victories as their very own. And yet, by 1776, those exact same people were firing muskets at British soldiers and declaring themselves a free and independent nation. So how exactly did that happen? Part 1. The Spark. 13 Separate Worlds. To truly understand this spark, we have to look at the status quo of the time. These distant, rivalrous colonies actually felt deep pride in being British, but they felt almost zero connection to each other. We're talking about a coastal people, separated by vast distances, who looked outward toward the Atlantic rather than inward at their neighbors. Sure, they shared a king and a language, but they were deeply suspicious of each other's manners and cultures. New England was defined by its Puritan roots, town meetings, and stony soil. The middle colonies were this incredibly diverse patchwork of Dutch, German, and Scots-Irish immigrants. And the southern colonies? Vast plantation economies heavily dependent on enslaved labor. They squabbled over trade, religion, borders, literally everything. The idea that these 13 completely separate worlds could ever unite would have sounded completely ridiculous to anyone in the 1760s. Moving on to Part 2, the argument catches fire. Everything really began to shift following the incredibly expensive 7 Years' War. Britain had just won this massive global victory against France, securing the North American continent, but, well, it nearly bankrupted their treasury to do it. So to pay down that massive debt, London decided the colonists needed to start paying their fair share. And when you trace the events of those years, you can see exactly how this escalated from polite ledger disputes right into open street rebellion. First, London instituted the Stamp Act in 1765, directly taxing everyday items like legal documents and newspapers. This completely crossed a line. The colonists strongly felt that only their local assemblies had the right to tax them. The pushback was fierce. We're talking non-importation agreements, boycotts, and highly organized resistance by groups like the Sons of Liberty. They actually forced London to repeal the act, only for Parliament to turn around and pass the townshend duties shortly after. The friction was really mounting now. This brings us to an absolutely crucial moment. When British soldiers killed 5 colonists in a chaotic street brawl on a freezing night in 1770, Patriot leaders realized something profound. How an event is remembered matters just as much as the event itself. What started as a tense standoff over jobs and insults, with colonists basically chucking ice and snow at frightened soldiers, was quickly transformed. Silversmith Paul Revere pumped out this highly inaccurate but brilliantly effective engraving showing an organized, cold-blooded execution by British troops. He branded it the Boston Massacre, and man, that image seared itself into the colonial imagination, uniting the colonies in a sense of shared outrage. Then the tension completely boiled over in December 1773. London tried to force cheap, but still taxed, East India Company tea on the colonies. In response, Bostonians, thinly disguised as Mohawk warriors, boarded the ships and dumped thousands of pounds of tea straight into the harbor. This bold, incredibly theatrical destruction of property enraged London. They fired back with the crushing, intolerable acts, specifically designed to isolate and punish Massachusetts by closing its port and suspending its government. But ironically, instead of isolating them, it completely united the colonies in sympathy. The other 12 colonies took a look at this and realized, hey, if London can do this to Massachusetts, absolutely no one's rights are safe. Which brings us to Part 3, The Forge, the point of no return. By 1775, colonial militias were actively stockpiling weapons, and when British General Gage tried to seize them at Lexington and Concord, that simmering political argument finally exploded into a shooting war. A secret night march by British regulars ended with a chaotic skirmish echoing around the world, resulting in a bloody, harrowing retreat for the British back to Boston. But here's the crazy part. Even after the fighting had started, many colonists were terrified to actually pull the trigger on declaring full independence. That is, until a recent immigrant named Thomas Paine published a pamphlet called Common Sense in early 1776. It spread like wildfire. Paine shattered the taboo of attacking the monarchy itself, arguing in this plain, blazing language that it was completely absurd for a vast continent to be ruled by a tiny distant island. He gave ordinary people the vocabulary to demand total independence, which perfectly set the stage for Thomas Jefferson to draft the Declaration of Independence that very July. Now, when you lay out the facts of this staggering military mismatch side by side, it becomes crystal clear why George Washington's greatest asset wasn't necessarily his tactical genius, but his unyielding endurance. The British possessed the greatest military machine on earth. Washington, on the other hand, was commanding a disorganized, chronically underfunded collection of farmers whose enlistments just kept expiring every few months. In fact, Washington lost battle after battle in the defense of New York in 1776, barely escaping with just a fraction of his freezing, starving army into New Jersey. After that disastrous retreat through New York that nearly destroyed the entire cause, Washington took a completely desperate gamble at Trenton. On Christmas night in 1776, with enlistments about to expire and the Revolution literally on life support, Washington led his exhausted men across the ice-choked Delaware River. They marched through a blinding sleet storm. Some men were leaving actual bloody footprints in the snow, and miraculously surprised a Hessian garrison right at dawn. Tactically, it wasn't a massive strategic victory, but psychologically, it completely revived the Revolution and convinced his men to stay and fight. Then comes 1777, the absolute turning point of the conflict. British General John Burgoyne tried to cut off New England entirely by marching an army down from Canada right through the dense New York wilderness. But his heavy artillery and massive luxury baggage train slowed him to a crawl. Swarms of American militia surrounded him, trapping his exhausted army at Saratoga and forcing a total surrender. This stunning victory was a game-changer. It proved to the entire world that the Americans could actually fight, officially turning a colonial rebellion into a global war, mainly because Benjamin Franklin successfully used this exact victory to bring France's navy and military might into the fray. But surviving this war meant more than just winning on the battlefield. It meant surviving the brutal elements. During the harsh winter of 1777 at Valley Forge, Washington's men lacked basic food, shoes, and blankets. Thousands tragically died of disease and exposure in camp. Yet the survivors who marched out of Valley Forge were finally capable of fighting the British toe-to-toe. And this was largely thanks to a very colorful Prussian officer named Baron von Steuben. He spent the winter bellowing orders in a wild mix of French and German, relentlessly drilling those ragged soldiers until they became a highly disciplined professional fighting force. Part 4. The Legacy. The world turned upside down. Frustrated up north by Washington's newly professional army, the British completely shifted strategies and moved the war down south, hoping to find massive loyalist support. Instead, they walked right into a vicious civil war of guerrilla ambush and reprisal. Irregular Patriot fighters engaged in brutal hit-and-run warfare, constantly harassing British supply lines. This relentless Southern campaign completely exhausted British General Lord Cornwallis, forcing him to retreat to the coastal town of Yorktown, Virginia, just to rest and resupply by sea. And that is when everything miraculously aligned. American General Nathaniel Greene had pinned Cornwallis down. Suddenly, a massive French fleet arrives to block the sea escape, while Washington and French General Rochambeau secretly speed march their armies all the way down from New York to close the siege lines by land. Cornwallis was trapped. Under relentless bombardment, he surrendered his army, effectively breaking Britain's will to fight. The world had, quite literally, turned upside down. Finally, Part 5. An imperfect new nation. So the war is won. The 1783 Treaty of Paris formally recognizes the United States and grants the new country vast western territories. But honestly, winning the war was only half the battle. They had just fought off a powerful central government, but the loose, incredibly weak alliance they formed during the war was completely failing. They couldn't pay their debts, they couldn't regulate trade, they couldn't even put down internal rebellions.
So in 1787, leaders returned to Philadelphia to secretly draft the Constitution, forging a much more powerful central government. They designed this ingenious system of checks and balances, an executive, a legislature, and a judiciary, so that no single branch could ever become a tyrant. But, and this is crucial, to keep the southern states on board and actually ratify this new government, they made dark, deliberate compromises regarding human bondage. The institution of slavery, which directly contradicted the very core of their revolutionary ideals, was accommodated and protected in this new framework.
So what does this all mean for us today? I want to leave you with this really provocative thought about how the founders' unresolved compromises left a festering wound that would shape the country's entire future. Think about it. They fought a spectacular, highly improbable revolution based on universal human rights, yet they built their new republic partially on the backs of enslaved people. The words Thomas Jefferson wrote, that all men are created equal, were initially meant for a pretty narrow circle of property-owning men. But those universal words simply couldn't be contained. They escaped their author's control, laying the essential groundwork for generations of excluded people to demand the true fulfillment of the American promise. And that ongoing struggle, sparked by this deeply imperfect, incredibly fascinating revolution, is what truly forged the American identity.